Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have existed for roughly 300,000 years. That sounds like a lot until you realize our genus, Homo, first showed up around 2.8 million years ago. So for the vast majority of human evolutionary history, we weren't even here yet. Other species were doing the whole being human thing long before us, and frankly, some of them were doing it for way longer than we have so far. Homo erectus, for example, survived for nearly 2 million years. 2 million years. To put that in perspective, all of recorded human history, every civilization, every empire, every war, every Renaissance painting, every poorly timed tweet, fits inside the last 5,000 years. Homo erectus beat that by a factor of 400. They spread out of Africa, colonized Asia, reached the Indonesian archipelago, figured out fire, developed sophisticated stone tool traditions, and kept going and going and going for an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. And yet, they're gone. We're not. Why? But before we get to the why, we need to properly understand the who, because most people have a genuinely impoverished picture of how many human species were actually walking around this planet at the same time. For most of the 20th century, scientists thought human evolution was relatively simple. One species evolved into another, which evolved into another, in a nice linear sequence, almost like a family tree that only ever grows upward with one branch. Tidy, understandable, very convenient for textbook illustrations. Then we got better at finding bones, and then we got even better at extracting DNA from those bones. And then ancient DNA technology basically exploded in the last 15 years, giving us the ability to read the genetic code of individuals who died tens of thousands of years ago. And suddenly the picture transformed into something far messier, far more interesting, and honestly a little bit chaotic. At various points in the last 300,000 years alone, there were at least 5 or 6 distinct human species sharing the planet. You had Homo sapiens, that's us, spreading out of Africa. You had Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals, dominating Europe and Western Asia with extraordinary success. You had the Denisovans, a mysterious group known almost entirely from a finger bone and a few teeth found in a Siberian cave, yet genetically distinct enough to constitute their own species. You had Homo floresiensis, tiny humans barely a meter tall, living on the Indonesian island of Flores, sometimes affectionately called the hobbits of the human family. You had Homo luzonensis, discovered only in 2019 from fossils in the Philippines, pushing back the timeline of hominin presence in Southeast Asia. You had the Red Deer cave people in southern China, who may represent yet another distinct lineage that survived until as recently as 11,000 years ago. 11,000 years ago. Let that sink in. Agriculture was already being invented. The first proto-cities were forming in the Middle East. Humans were already keeping goats and planting wheat, and there was still another human species out there, somewhere in the hills of Yunnan province, living their lives, completely unaware that they were about to become a footnote in our textbooks. Or perhaps they were simply absorbed into the growing populations of modern humans around them, their bones eventually indistinguishable from ours, their memory lost. This is the world that existed before it didn't, a world with multiple kinds of people in it, a world that was, by any reasonable definition, far more interesting than the one we inhabit now. Now let's talk about the Neanderthals properly, because they deserve far more credit than they typically get. For a long time, popular culture painted them as brutish, dim-witted cavemen, who were basically just waiting around to be replaced by us clever, sophisticated Homo sapiens. Big brows, small brains, bad posture, zero fashion sense. Essentially, the evolutionary equivalent of that one guy at the office who refuses to learn how to use the printer correctly. That image is completely wrong, and the scientific community has been trying to correct it for decades, with limited success because Neanderthals were actually pretty sophisticated. Doesn't trend as well as stock photos of hunched, grunting cave dwellers. Here are the actual facts. Neanderthals had brains that were, on average, slightly larger than ours. Not smaller, larger. They made stone tools using a technique called le valois napping that required planning several steps ahead. You can't do it by accident or by instinct. It requires genuine foresight and mental modeling of the outcome before you begin. They controlled fire with expertise. They hunted large game, mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave bears, bison, using coordinated strategies that required communication and cooperation. They buried their dead, sometimes in what appear to be deliberately arranged positions, with grave goods nearby. Some burials seem to include flowers, though this remains debated, but the very existence of deliberate burial practices suggests ritual. Ritual suggests symbolic thought. Symbolic thought suggests a level of cognitive and emotional sophistication that should give anyone pause. They also made art. Cave paintings in Spain, at La Pasiega, at Ardals, at Maltravieso, have been dated to over 65,000 years ago, using uranium-thorium dating methods that bypass the limitations of radiocarbon dating. At 65,000 years ago, Homo sapiens hadn't even arrived in Europe yet, which means Neanderthals painted those. They were making personal ornaments from eagle talons and shells. They were mixing pigments, ochre and manganese dioxide, possibly to paint their bodies or their environments. They were doing things that we only recently acknowledged as uniquely human. Neanderthals were people, not proto-people, not failed people, and roughly 40,000 years ago, they vanished. The timing is not a coincidence. That's almost exactly when Homo sapiens began spreading into Europe in significant numbers. We show up, they disappear. The correlation is hard to ignore, even if the causal mechanism is fiercely debated. So what actually happened? This is where scientists have been arguing for decades, and where the honest answer is probably more complicated and more morally uncomfortable than any single clean explanation. Theory number 1, we outcompeted them, not through direct violence, but through something closer to economic or ecological displacement. The idea is that Homo sapiens had advantages in certain cognitive domains, particularly in language, abstract reasoning, and the ability to build and maintain large social networks that allowed us to operate at a scale Neanderthals couldn't match. Where a Neanderthal band might number 20 or 30 individuals, early Homo sapiens groups could coordinate across hundreds, even thousands, of people through shared symbols, stories, and obligations. Trade networks formed, information flowed, technological innovations spread faster. Imagine you're a Neanderthal hunting band. You know your territory intimately, you're superbly adapted to your local climate, you're physically stronger than the newcomers moving into your region, but they have contact with groups 3 valleys over, and those groups have contact with groups even further away. When prey migrates, they learn where it went through a network of shared information. When someone invents a better spear point somewhere to the south, it reaches them within a generation. You're working with your band's accumulated knowledge alone. They're working with the accumulated knowledge of a continental network. Over thousands of years, that kind of structural advantage compounds silently and devastatingly. You don't need to defeat your competitor in a dramatic confrontation. You just need to be slightly better at surviving bad winters, at finding food in lean years, at recovering from disease outbreaks, at bouncing back after environmental shocks. Do that consistently, across generation after generation, and the math takes care of itself. No battles required, no grand extinction event, just the slow grinding arithmetic of ecological competition. Theory number 2 is darker, and it requires us to be honest about what Homo sapiens is actually like as a species. There's archaeological evidence, at several sites, of Neanderthal bones bearing cut marks consistent with butchering. At Moulagirsi in France and Goyet Cave in Belgium, the evidence is particularly striking. Neanderthal bones that were deliberately broken and processed in ways that suggest deliberate defleshing. Now, some researchers interpret this as evidence of funerary practices or survival cannibalism within Neanderthal communities themselves, but other sites suggest violent conflict between species, and the uncomfortable reality is this: Homo sapiens has never been shy about violence toward groups perceived as different, threatening, or simply in the way. We were doing it 10,000 years ago. We were doing it 1,000 years ago. We were doing it last century, with industrial efficiency. The idea that our ancestors might have actively hunted, displaced, or massacred Neanderthal groups in some contexts is not a fringe hypothesis. It's taken seriously by serious researchers. The debate isn't about whether violence occurred at all. It almost certainly did, somewhere, at some scale. The debate is about whether it was the primary driver of extinction, or one ugly thread in a much more complex tapestry. Most researchers today favor a synthesis: competition plus occasional violence, plus disease transmission, plus habitat pressure, plus climate instability, all layered on top of each other across millennia. Neanderthals were probably already under stress from a volatile climate before we arrived in force. We didn't necessarily deliver one fatal blow. We may have simply been the last straw in a series of mounting pressures that their populations, never large, never dense, couldn't absorb. And then there's the twist, the one that rewrote everything. We also had sex with them, not metaphorically, literally. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred on multiple occasions, in multiple locations, over tens of thousands of years. We know this because their DNA is inside us right now. If you are of non-African descent, between 1 and 4% of your genome is Neanderthal in origin. If you have ancestry from parts of Southeast Asia and Oceania, you likely also carry Denisovan DNA. In some populations in in Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australia, that proportion reaches 6%. Let that actually land for a second. We didn't just encounter these other human species at a distance, exchange suspicious glances, and go our separate ways. We formed relationships with them, we had children with them. Those children survived and reproduced, carrying mixed ancestry that has now persisted for tens of thousands of years and is still circulating in billions of living humans today. That tan you get in summer, part of the genetic machinery that allows it traces back to a Neanderthal gene variant that was so useful to populations moving into higher latitudes that natural selection preserved it. Certain immune system variants, particularly in the HLA system, which helps your body recognize and respond to pathogens, carry Neanderthal signatures. Populations living at high altitudes in Tibet carry a specific variant of the EPAS1 gene, crucial for oxygen metabolism in thin air, that appears to have come from Denisovans. A Denisovan variant, still working, still useful, inside people who are alive right now, which means the story of what happened to the other human species is not simply a story of replacement, it's also a story of absorption. Partial, complicated, messy absorption, but absorption nonetheless. The other humans didn't entirely vanish into nothing. Some of them, in a very real and literally biological sense, became part of us. Now, let's talk about the Denisovans, because they might be the strangest and most humbling chapter in this entire story, and they are criminally underrepresented in popular science coverage. We know they existed. We know they interbred with modern humans on at least 2 separate occasions, in at least 2 different geographic regions. We know they occupied at least part of the Tibetan Plateau. We know from a jawbone found in Baishya Karst Cave in Tibet, at an altitude of 3,280 meters, that they were adapted to high-altitude environments at a time when it's not clear Homo sapiens could even survive there, and we know from genetic evidence that they were present across a sweeping arc of Asia, from Siberia down through Southeast Asia and into the Pacific. What we don't know is almost everything else, because our physical fossil record of the Denisovans consists of a finger bone, a few isolated teeth, and that partial jawbone from Tibet. That's it. An entire human species, successful, widespread, behaviorally complex enough to interbreed with us and leave lasting genetic marks on living populations. Reduced in the material record to a handful of fragments, we have more surviving physical evidence of individual Roman senators than we do of the entire Denisovan lineage. And yeah, through ancient DNA technology, which is genuinely one of the most remarkable scientific achievements of the past 20 years, we can tell that they had dark skin, dark hair, and brown eyes. We can tell that they were genetically closer to Neanderthals than to modern humans. We can tell that they were diverse enough within their own lineage to show substantial genetic variation across populations. All of that reconstructed from fragments that would fit in the palm of your hand. There's something almost unbearably poignant about it. Somewhere, in the mountains of Central Asia, in the forests of Southeast Asia, on the shores of islands that may not even exist anymore due to rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, Denisovan communities lived. They had fires. They probably had language of some kind. They had knowledge of their landscapes built up over generations. They had presumably something like culture, something like tradition, something like stories. And then they disappeared so completely that for the entirety of recorded human history, we had no idea they had ever existed at all. We found out about them in 2010, from a bone that a child lost in a cave 50,000 years ago. Homo floresiensis deserves its own moment of attention because the hobbit humans of Flores are one of the most genuinely baffling discoveries in all of paleoanthropology, and they raise questions that still haven't been fully answered. First uncovered in 2003 in Liangbua Cave on the Indonesian island of Flores, these individuals stood about 1.1 meters tall, roughly the height of a modern 6-year-old. And had brains roughly the size of a grapefruit. By the standards of what scientists assumed about brain-to-intelligence ratios, that's a remarkably small brain for a species capable of complex behavior, and yet they made sophisticated stone tools that required planning and skill. They hunted pygmy stegodons, miniaturized extinct elephants, which is not the kind of prey you take down by accident. They managed fire. They appear to have had social structures complex enough to sustain multi-generational knowledge transmission. Their existence was a direct challenge to what was called the cerebral Rubicon, the idea that a brain had to reach a certain minimum size to support genuinely human-level cognition. The hobbits said, actually, no, it's about the organization of the brain, not just its raw volume, and that realization has reshaped how scientists think about intelligence, evolution, and the relationship between anatomy and behavior. They survived on Flores until at least 50,000 years ago, possibly much more recently. The island geology is complicated. Some researchers argue for survival as late as 12,000 years ago, and then, like the others, they vanished. The timing, once again, correlates with the expansion of modern humans into the region. So we come back to the central question, why us? Why, out of all of these species, some adapted to harsher climates than we can tolerate, some that had survived for millions of years, some with brains as large or larger than ours? Did Homo sapiens end up as the last human standing? The honest answer is that we don't know with certainty, but the best current synthesis points to several interlocking factors. Language and symbolic cognition at a level no other species quite achieved. Not just communication. Every social animal communicates in some form, but the specific capacity to construct and share what you might call agreed-upon fictions, abstract concepts, group identities based on shared narratives rather than direct personal relationships, roles and stories and obligations that could bind thousands of strangers together into coherent, coordinated societies. The ability to say, this territory belongs to our group and we will collectively defend it, or this action violated our shared code and must be punished. Or, we owe each other because of a common ancestor none of us has ever met. That kind of thinking allows social organization at scales no primate band structure can reach through personal trust alone. It's the engine behind everything from tribal alliances to nation-states to the global economy, and it appears to be something Homo sapiens developed to a degree unmatched by any contemporary species. Add to that a remarkable and apparently unique capacity for cumulative cultural evolution, where other hominin species had tool traditions that remained largely static for hundreds of thousands of years. The Neanderthal-Mousterian tradition, sophisticated as it was, changed relatively slowly. Homo sapiens technology began accelerating in a way that looks qualitatively different. We didn't just invent, we built on inventions. We iterated, we innovated on top of prior innovation, compounding improvement across generations and across geographically dispersed groups. The pace of change began to increase exponentially rather than linearly. Once that dynamic kicks in, the advantages it confers compound into something no competing population can keep pace with. And then there's the sheer opportunistic flexibility of our species ecologically. Homo sapiens is generalist enough to colonize almost any environment on Earth and specialized enough to thrive within it once established. We ate almost anything. We wore the skins of animals adapted to climates we couldn't otherwise survive in. We built shelters. We followed prey across continents. By the time the populations of other species were coming under serious stress from climate instability and habitat change, Homo sapiens groups had already spread into virtually every inhabitable ecosystem on the planet and were establishing feedback loops of population growth, resource extraction, and cultural exchange that no contemporary competitor could disrupt. There is a version of this story that is triumphant. Look at us. We made it. Against considerable odds, against a volatile climate, against competition from multiple other intelligent species, we survived. We're here. 7 billion of us, building cities and composing symphonies and sending telescopes into space, and yes, arguing on the internet about the precise mechanism by which we may have contributed to the extinction of our evolutionary relatives. But there is another version of this story, and it's less comfortable to sit with. Every other human species is gone, and in virtually every case, their disappearance correlates, temporally, geographically, with our expansion into their territory. We may not have planned it. We almost certainly didn't organize it as a deliberate campaign. It happened slowly, across thousands of years, through processes that no individual would have recognized as extinction in progress. But the pattern is there, and it is consistent, and it deserves honest acknowledgement. We are the most successful large-brained primate in the history of life on Earth. We are also, as best we can reconstruct, implicated in the disappearance of every close relative we ever encountered. That combination should feel like something, not guilt in any simple or paralyzing sense. No one alive today caused any of this. But something, a recognition of what we are and what we've always been capable of, and how little that has changed in the tens of thousands of years since our ancestors watched the last Neanderthal fires go dark somewhere in the mountains of southern Europe. The fact that we're alone now feels completely normal to us. It is all any living human has ever known. There are no Neanderthals at the train station, there are no Denisovans in your contacts. The concept of sharing the planet with another human species, another kind of people, looking something like us, behaving something like us, thinking something like us, feels like the premise of a fantasy novel. But for most of human history, that was just Tuesday. Our ancestors navigated a world with multiple kinds of people in it. They saw Neanderthal faces across campfires and across territorial boundaries. They encountered Denisovans in the mountain passes of Central Asia. They may have watched Homo floresiensis from the tree lines of Indonesian islands and had no framework for understanding what they were looking at because we barely have one now. The plurality of human life was simply the condition of existence for most of our species' history. We collapsed all of that. However it happened, and for whatever combination of reasons, we ended it. We became the last. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is that the evidence of those lost relatives didn't disappear entirely. It survived in us, in the 1 to 4% of non-African human genomes that traces back to Neanderthal ancestors, in the Denisovan altitude adaptation still helping Tibetan shepherds breathe. At 4,000 meters, in the immune system variants that may have helped ancient human populations survive diseases they'd never encountered before. We carry them, unknowingly, invisibly, in every cell of our bodies. The vanished species are inside us, folded into our biology, still quietly contributing to our survival tens of thousands of years after the last of their kind drew their last breath. Why are we the only human species left? Because we were slightly better in enough of the ways that mattered, for long enough, across enough generations, in enough environments, to end up on the last page of a story that had many, many characters, and because some of those other characters, in the most literal sense imaginable, never entirely left.